Hey, everybody, and thanks for joining us for the latest Sounds Profitable research study, Safe and Sound. Really appreciate you being here. If you look up to the left of my head, you'll see our brand new logo, which you'll see on our brand new website in less than a month from now. We're super excited about that. So look for that in the future. But today is all about brand safety and brand suitability. And this is a study that I'm super proud of. It's an incredible piece of work. Really thankful for the sponsors to this particular piece of research, because it basically addresses a lot of questions that I know people are getting asked in podcasting about brand safety, brand suitability. Is it a thing? And there seems to be this opinion with some, I think, buyers in the advertising world and agencies that podcasting, may or may not be safe for advertising. And there's also some questions about, what happens if a podcast host kind of goes off the rails, all of that. And a lot of the opinions that people have about that they're just that, opinions. We wanted to do something based on the opinions of the people that matter, which are, of course, the listeners. And so this is the first publicly available study of podcast listeners and how they feel about what may or may not offend them, how they react to potentially offensive content, and whether or not they transfer that to the brands that advertise on that content. So let's go ahead and get started with Safe and Sound, Sounds Profitable's study of brand suitability. First of all, I want to thank these leaders in podcasting for helping to bring this to you. And I mean leaders in the space: SXM Media, Veritone One, Mopod, BetterHelp, AudioHook, Wondery, Barometer, and NPR. We're so grateful to you for helping us bring this to all of you, because there's some incredible information in here, much of it never before seen or never even suspected. So let's get started. If you were going to advertise with a brand, well, let's say you were going to do some influencer marketing or perhaps some advertising in media, and you were given the following choice: which is more brand safe for you? Advertising on Saturday Night Live or hiring Kanye West as an influencer? I think you know the answer to this already, that if you were going to use Kanye West as an influencer, that's probably not the greatest choice, right? Absolutely not brand safe. 100% not brand safe. Had a very controversial anti-Semitic tweet. I'm a bit sleepy. When I wake up, I'm going DEFCON 3 on some brand safety and suitability research. I'm sure you have seen the tweet, right? Not particularly brand safe, not particularly, obviously extremely dangerous for a brand to be associated with Kanye West, much more so than SNL. And in fact, a number of really high profile brands dropped Kanye West. The Gap dropped Kanye West. Adidas, probably the most costly one for him, dropped him. And even Balenciaga dropped Kanye West. Balenciaga dropped Kanye West. Balenciaga, this company, dropped Kanye West. But I will tell you who did not suffer from this, and that is the medium that actually posted the tweet, right? The medium that actually posted the tweet was Twitter. Twitter did not suffer from this. In fact, Twitter did not have any feedback or blowback with brands at all until the star of the Twitter show, the host of the Twitter show, Elon Musk, started to become somewhat not safe for brands as well, right? So the medium in this case was not punished. And I think that's generally true when we think about the medium that people choose to advertise in, the medium that hosts content. It's often more about the host. It's often more about the personality that's associated with it than it is the medium itself, right? So Saturday Night Live was not punished for brand unsafety, even though they had this guy who towed right up to the line of anti-Semitism a couple of weeks ago. And I think some would agree, crossed over it, right? This guy, not the most brand safe personality in the world. And even as far back as Sinead O'Connor tearing up a picture of the Pope. I mean, SNL has had a number of things broadcast in their live performances that are not necessarily brand safe, including this guy. The last performance of Kanye West on Saturday Night Live was actually mostly edited out, right? So SNL is not punished or deemed brand unsafe for some of the things that have happened. It's really the host, it's really the personality. And just as you can remember some of the brands that Kanye West was associated with, right? Adidas, Gap, Balenciaga, very notable endorsements, right? You can't name any advertisers on SNL. You probably can't. I'll give you one. Tults. What a terrible name. Tults. Anyway, you can't remember those advertisers. You did not punish those advertisers. You associate the not suitable, not safe content on SNL with the host and not necessarily with the medium, right? There's a very strong host-based endorsement of all of that. So we wanted to find out, how does that relate to podcasting? Do people feel the same about Joe Rogan, obviously one of the most controversial podcast hosts we have, as they do The Daily, which may or may not have potentially controversial topics, right? But we wanted to do that from the standpoint of the listener. Thank you, Ariel Nissenblad, for being our stock photography star. We wanted to find out from the perspective of the listener, because we haven't really had that in podcasting before. So how do the listeners feel about brand safety? How do the listeners feel about brand suitability? And what offends them? How do they feel about offensive topics? And do they, in fact, translate that and relate it to brands? The way that we did that was with research. That's kind of what I do. And this is with a survey of weekly podcast consumers that we did in partnership with Edison Research. We interviewed almost 1,100 monthly podcast consumers about some of these issues. And the data here was weighted to the sex, age, and ethnicity of monthly podcast listeners from the Infinite Dial. So I'll just really quick give you some of the demographics here. But again, this is weighted to the national norms for these data. Podcast listeners, monthly podcast listeners, slightly more male, 52% men. And again, I'm only giving you this as a quick background for everything else that you're about to see. Demographics, 42% 18 to 34, 37% 35 to 54, and 21% 55 plus, which is a demographic that I've spoken a lot about, and we'll have a fair amount to talk about in this particular presentation. And we also asked people what categories of content that they listen to. Comedy continues to be the number one category of content. 47% of monthly podcast consumers say that they listen to comedy. But we're going to talk about really three of the top five here: comedy, politics, and true crime. And those are some of the categories that I think people have potentially indicated that there may be some issues with brands, all three of which have had kind of different issues that advertisers and podcast producers have heard in terms of advertising on those particular genres. We also asked people, what are your top three? And these are the percentages that ranked each genre within the top three. Again, comedy, music, true crime, sports, and politics. We're going to have something to say about three of those in today's presentation: comedy, true crime, and politics. We also asked about a few podcasts in particular, some big ones. We knew we would get some response here because they're extremely well listened to. The Joe Rogan Experience, The Ben Shapiro Show, The Rachel Maddow Show, and Call Her Daddy. These are the percentages of listeners that have heard of those shows. And these are the percentages that say they have ever listened to those podcasts. And I know I've told you again and again that the Joe Rogan Experience is the number one podcast in America. And here's even more proof of that, right? Now, what I would love to be able to tell podcast publishers is that there are no brand safety issues with podcasts whatsoever, that your podcast can say anything it wants, and it's not going to reflect poorly on the brand. This, my friends, is a fantasy. This is not true. And it's the same with podcasting as it is in any other medium. When you ask people in a hypothetical scenario, If they hear something that is offensive in a podcast and it's advertised by a brand, do they associate the brand in any way with that offensive material? And in a hypothetical situation, just as in any other medium, people will say that about podcasting, right? So let's go through kind of point by point some of the observations from these data, and you'll see that even though people will tell you that they are potentially that they will potentially view a brand in a different way, they're also not as offended by things as you might think, right? But first of all, just as I mentioned, when brands sponsor content that listeners find offensive, podcasting is no different to any other media. It's no different to TV, radio, media on the web. Some listeners will associate the brand with that content. When we ask people, how would you feel about the brands that advertised or sponsored a podcast where the host or guest talked about something that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable, 19% would have a much lower opinion of the brand, and another 31% a somewhat lower opinion of brand. Again, this is a hypothetical. This is not any different than you would see, honestly, in any other medium. So podcasting is just no different from that. And then we asked, would your opinion of a brand that advertised or sponsored a podcast with offensive content, for those who said it was lower, why would it be lower? And you see some really similar percentages here, all about 38, 39%. There's a sort of a hard core of people that say, well, if you offend me, I would think that the brand supports the offensive content that I heard. I would think the brand was not careful in deciding what podcast to advertise on. And I would associate the brand with that offensive content. Again, about 38% agree with all of that. And you'll see that exactly in this graph. We asked people how much they agreed or disagreed that they would no longer consider a brand if it advertised on a podcast with offensive content. Again, 38% said that they agreed with that. But I will point out that 62% here, nearly 2/3, don't agree with that. Now, that's for something that is considered offensive, right? And then there's, of course, the activist behavior. Have you ever boycotted a brand because they supported a podcast that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable? 23% agree with that. I'm going to show you some interesting breakdowns of that as we go a little bit further on. But here's the thing. What actually offends most podcast listeners falls in a very narrow range. It's really hard to indicate what offensive content really is, right? Everybody has their own definition of that. So we asked people a whole bunch of offensive things. We did not actually field an offensive survey. I hope not. But we did ask people if they ever listen to podcasts that involve some of these topics that are potentially offensive to some people or potentially offensive or potentially make people uncomfortable, right? And what you see here at the top of the list is that there are tons of podcast listeners that actually do listen to podcasts with vulgarity, political views that are different, discussions of sexual preference or gender identity, frank discussions of racial politics, right? It's only at the very bottom where you get to things that people generally don't listen to, racist language and sexist language. Now, that's what they tell us they listen to, what actually offends them. And it's this list completely flipped. The percentage of podcast listeners who say they are very offended or comfortable or uncomfortable to hearing a podcast with racist language, 44%. Sexist language, jokes about religion. This list is actually completely flipped. So what we see here is that a lot of podcast listeners actually seek out content that might be potentially offensive or uncomfortable, right? Whether that's vulgarity or discussions of sex. And we'll get to some, well, we won't get to any sex in this. This is a research family presentation. We won't get to that, but we'll get to a podcast that does. But what's at the top here are what people in general are actually offended by. And when you ask people which of the following would make you feel the most offended or uncomfortable, everything kind of drops away after racist language, right? So here is, I think, a stunning observation based on an insightful read of the data, which I give to you. And that is this: don't be racist. But in general, what you see here is that most podcast listeners actually seek out content that may or may not be deemed offensive or potentially offensive to some people, right? There's actually a very narrow window of things that are truly offensive to people where they might take it into account and then hold the brands accountable that sponsor that particular content. And that's especially true 18 to 54, with the exception of racist material, which is number one with a bullet here, and to a lesser degree, sexist material or ridiculing religion, a thing we continue to have a problem with. Podcast listeners who are 18 to 54 are relatively tolerant of many categories of what you might consider potentially unsettling or potentially offensive. And in fact, as I showed you, many seek it out. And I, when we asked, do you ever listen to podcasts that involve some of these potentially offensive or unsettling categories, you see that 18 to 34 and even 35 to 54 actually seek out a lot of this content. And I'll point at the very top one here, swear words, vulgarity, and at the bottom, explicit discussions of sex. That is far less listened to by 55 plus. But if you're 18 to 34 or 35 to 54, you're actually seeking a lot of this stuff out. It doesn't actually offend you. And again, the racist language, sexist language, not necessarily the case, right? And here is page 2. And what's kind of interesting about all of this is that the younger demographics, again, much more likely to say, I actually listen to the content that features these things. I actually seek it out. 55 plus are far less likely to say that they even listen to that kind of material, which is really, really interesting. Obviously, they have their part to play in the data here. And I've talked a lot about 55 plus being kind of blue ocean and underserved in podcasting. And this may be in partially one reason why that is the case, right? That they do not seek out this kind of content, right? And when you ask people again, which would make you feel the most offended or uncomfortable, there's some broad agreement here with racist language, but the 55 plus bar is really, really spread out, right? Again, 18 to 34, 35 to 54, it really coalesces around racist language. But when you look at some of the other categories here, some of the other demographics, you see that there's a big difference, 18 to 34 and 55 plus. 55 plus actually begins to take a little bit more offense to some things. What's fascinating about that is that they are far more sensitive to potentially offensive content, but they're also more likely to sculpt their listening to completely avoid it, right? And that's really, I think, the biggest point that I'm going to make today is that 55 plus, and indeed everybody in podcasting, self-selects the content that they want to consume. So 18 to 54, they might self-select content which is potentially offensive because they want to. 55 plus, they do not self-select that kind of content. They seek to avoid it. They are potentially more offended by a lot of different categories there, but they actually don't even listen to podcasts that do that, which means they're not going to face that choice of being offended by a podcast and then associating potentially offensive content with brands. We ask people, how often would you say, again, you listen to a podcast that discussed topics that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable? Look how low 55 plus is here. The frequently is just 3% and the sometimes 18%. So again, 55 plus potentially more offended by more of those topics that we talked about, but they also avoid podcasts, which means that there's a giant swath of podcast listeners that either seek out potentially offensive or uncomfortable content because they want to, in which case they wanted to, or they just completely avoid it, right? They don't choose to listen to it. So again, they're not getting necessarily those brand associations. We also asked, have you ever heard a podcast host say something that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable? And the 55 plus numbers here are about half of the other numbers, again, which means they're sculpting their listening to just avoid it. So they're not necessarily hearing things that might make them uncomfortable because they are not choosing to listen to podcasts that might, in fact, make them feel uncomfortable or offended. And then when we ask, and I showed you this a little bit earlier, How would you feel about the brands that advertised on or sponsored a podcast where the host or guest talked about something that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable? 55 plus are twice as likely to say that they would have a much lower opinion of the brand. But again, they're not listening to a lot of offensive content, right? They have basically self-selected themselves out of a lot of offensive content. So yeah, in a hypothetical, they would have a much lower opinion of a brand, but they're also not listening to a lot of things that might potentially offend them. Now, here's a key. Regular listeners to otherwise non-offensive shows are highly likely to return to the podcast after a single episode that features uncharacteristically offensive content. And I know that there's a lot of work and a lot of focus in podcasting on the brand safety of episode-to-episode content, real-time transcripts, things like that. But what we learned in this research is that if your podcast is generally not offensive, people aren't necessarily going to punish the show if it, as an outlier, dips into something that might be offensive or might be uncomfortable. The real key here is the host, which I'll get to in a moment. So we asked people which of the following best describes what you would do if a podcast you regularly listen to featured an episode that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable. 80% would continue listening to that podcast. Only 20% say that they would stop listening to that episode and to all other episodes, right? A little bit of a difference there with gender. Women are slightly more likely to say, no, I'm out. But in general, about 80% of monthly podcast listeners say, if a podcast I regularly consume did something that was offensive and that's uncharacteristic, then I'm going to treat that as an outlier. I'm going to treat that as, in fact, uncharacteristic, which means they're not going to be offended in general, right? They're not going to be offended and associate that offensive content with the brands that advertise it. Same question by demographic. Again, you see a big difference here, 55 plus. A lot of the negatives that you see in the total numbers are really being driven 55 plus. And this is a great concern of mine because I am just months away from being 55 plus and apparently offended by everything. I hope that is not the case, but who knows what's going to happen in a few short months. I will start to respond very differently to podcasts and perhaps to you. I hope that's not true. But you see that is really driven 55 plus here. Again, 28% say they would stop listening to that episode and all other episodes, which is much higher than it is with 18 to 34 or 35 to 54. Now, here's the thing. People who are passionate about content that might be offensive or unsettling to others, right? That we might hypothetically say this is offensive or this is unsettling. People who are passionate about that content are actually extremely positive about the brands that support that content. And we're going to talk here specifically about comedy and true crime, which are two categories that I know a lot of our publisher and content partners hear back from brands like, I'm uncomfortable supporting comedy podcasts, or I'm uncomfortable supporting true crime podcasts because, I don't know, they're grisly. But actually, the people that are passionate about them are, in fact, passionate about the brands that support them. And let's start here. I already showed you what was on the left. The total, each genre here ranked within the top three: comedy, music, true crime, sports, and politics. If you look at that by men, comedy is really, really high, right? Sports is number one, generally not potentially offensive or unsettling. Unless you're a Patriots fan this year, I'm very unsettled. But comedy is certainly a big one. We hear a lot about comedy. This is my comedy idol. I got to see his last show at the Wilbur Theater in Boston. Rest in peace, Norm. But comedy is one of those genres that people are potentially offended or unsettled by. Right. But why do people listen to comedy podcasts? They listen because they improve their mood. They help pass the time. They provide an escape from reality. These are very lean back kinds of reasons, right? It's escapism. People lean back. They just want to laugh. And so when a comedy podcast gives them that, it provides that escapism. It provides that ability to lean back, get a bit of a laugh, get a bit of an escape from reality. And as a result, the people who listen to comedy podcasts, first of all, 72% say they're very comfortable with the subject matter discussed in the comedy podcast they listen to. Again, it's self-selected. And again, 70% say you think comedy podcasts are an appropriate place for brands to advertise. And I want to point out that anytime I show data like this that discusses the percentage of podcast listeners who are positive about advertising, anything greater than 0 is a result, right? We don't love ads. We don't listen to podcasts for ads. And yet 70% of comedy listeners say comedy podcasts are an appropriate place for brands to advertise. And in fact, the vast majority say that they like it when a brand supports their favorite comedy podcast. Again, in an environment where people don't love ads, they don't welcome ads in anything. 39% strongly agree, 27% agree, and almost no one disagrees that they like it when a brand supports their favorite comedy podcast. They also remember the brands, right? Very similar percentages. About 2/3 say they're more likely to remember a brand if it advertises on their favorite comedy podcast. Again, very little disagreement with that. Another category that I know some publishers hear back from advertisers: I don't want to be associated with true crime. I don't want my brand associated with grisly murders, right? But as I've just shown you, people are actually not incredibly offended by what they listen to, that they self-select, that they seek out to listen to. So if you are self-selecting to listen to a true crime podcast, you're getting exactly what you want. And what listeners tell us, and true crime is the #1 category with women. So if you want to reach women, it's kind of the best way to do it, right? So it's not necessarily the greatest category to completely skip if you're an advertiser. It's the #1 category with women. And again, there are a lot of lean back escapism reasons why people listen to true crime. They like solving mysteries. They like learning about the methods used to solve crimes. They help pass the time. Maybe they're learning how to commit crimes themselves. I don't know. Everything is educational. That's why they listen to true crime. But they're comfortable with the subject matter. That's why they're listening. That's why they self-selected it. And the majority say that true crime podcasts are an appropriate place for brands to advertise. And again, to put these numbers in perspective, that is the majority of true crime listeners saying they are positive about advertising. Anything above 0 is significant there, as far as I'm concerned. So do they like it when a brand supports their favorite true crime podcast? You betcha. Over half do. Very little disagreement here. The disagree and strongly disagree at the right. They do like it when a brand supports their favorite true crime podcast. They're positive about it. And they're more likely to remember that brand, right? Again, more than half say they are more likely to remember the brand if it advertises on their favorite true crime podcast. Very little strong disagreement with this. So whether true crime talks about potentially grisly or offensive topics or not, people self-select into it, and they appreciate the support that brands give that content so they can hear it for free, right? That's kind of how it all works. So I want to talk about a couple of specific podcasts here, because there's a real key distinction here between people who have heard of a show and people who actually listen to the show. We asked people how offensive they find the Joe Rogan Experience. And amongst those who have heard of the show, which is more than half the sample here, 15% say they find it very offensive. But of that 15%, with people who have heard of it but actually never listened, it's much higher than the percentage who say that they do listen to the show, right? So it kind of doesn't matter what the show does on the episode itself. Joe Rogan could interview the Pope, and the people who don't listen to the show but have an opinion about Joe Rogan are going to find it offensive. I don't know. Maybe the Pope offends you. But here's the key. If you do listen to the Joe Rogan show, you are much more favorable towards the brands that support it, right? If you have heard of the show but never listened, that's when you are much less favorable toward the brand at the bottom, 29%. But if you are a Joe Rogan listener, you're substantially more likely to say that you're favorable towards the brands that support that content, even though some people might find that content offensive. People who generally don't listen to the show. The people who do listen to the show are favorable towards the brand. And the people who don't support Joe Rogan, who think he is offensive, as I've just shown you, probably don't listen to him. We asked the same question about Caller Daddy because that's potentially offensive to people in kind of a different way, right? The Joe Rogan Experience, I think, offends some people politically. Caller Daddy is a show that features some frank discussions of sexuality. And if you've heard of it but never listened, you don't even know how offensive it is, which is why that 12% is lower here than the percentage you say they've ever listened to it, where they go, yeah, you know what? It is actually sometimes very offensive. But again, if you're listening to that show, you are seeking it out and you are much more favorable towards the brand that support that show. And you see that with the ever listen numbers here. 34% of the people who have ever listened are much more favorable towards the brands that support Caller Daddy compared to 7% who are much less favorable toward the brand. Again, you are self-selecting the content, you are seeking out the content, and you are supporting the brands that support that content. Now, I hinted at this before, and especially at the very beginning when I talked about the difference of advertising on SNL versus having your brand associated with Kanye West. The reputation of the host plays a much larger role here than the podcast itself, which means that the key is host safety and suitability. And that's more important than the details of a single episode, because as I have shown you, if there is an episode that is an outlier of a potential of a show that is characteristically not that offensive or controversial, people will in fact treat it as an outlier. They will understand that this normally doesn't happen, right? But if the show is generally offensive, a lot of that has to do with the host, and a lot of that has to do with the host in real life, off of the episode itself, and not necessarily the content of the episode. We asked people, have you ever stopped listening to a podcast because the show mentioned something that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable? 38%, that should be a familiar number from the beginning, said yes, but almost as many said they learned things about the podcast host that they did not like, right? And again, that is not about the content of the podcast itself. That is not about the transcripts of the episode. That's just about the host being a good person or not. Or if that host has done something in real life off of the show that actually offends people. And why that kind of matters with brands is that almost half of podcast listeners believe that the hosts have control over which brands advertise on their shows, which with, most of the kind of leading podcasts out there that have a lot of brand advertising, that's simply not the case, right? So that's an interesting misperception that when people hear, and especially with host read ads, right? When people hear the host read an ad, they believe that the host actually tried the product and endorsed it because they actually chose that sponsor or chose that advertiser, which is, of course, not generally the case, right? So the last thing I want to talk about today before I kind of wrap things up are politics, right? Politics are potentially really explosive topics, right? And one of the most interesting things, and I think this is relevant to content producers, I've talked a lot about the perspective of advertisers and brands, but with content producers, if you're thinking about political ads, if you're thinking about political endorsements, unless you are, of course, already a very polarized political show, it's potentially incredibly dangerous. One of the questions that we asked people we asked some questions about politics. First of all, we asked, did you vote? 81% of monthly podcast listeners say they voted in 2020. That's almost 20 percentage points higher than the general public. So these are very activist people, without a doubt. And we also asked them, what party did you register with? And podcasts continue to lean Democratic. They continue to lean liberal in terms of listening. It changes a little bit year by year and starts to get a little bit closer to the national average. But there's no question that podcast listeners lean a bit more liberal than the public at large, right? So we're dealing with a larger Democratic audience. We're dealing with a very activist audience that are much more likely to have voted. And there are some differences there. If you're a Democrat or Republican, there are some differences in what you find offensive, right? There's a big gap here between Democrats and Republicans saying that racist language is the most offensive thing that they could hear on a podcast. And you see some of the other topics pop up a little bit more, jokes about religion, explicit discussions of sex, discussions of sexual preference, gender identity, promotion of alcohol or illegal drugs, things like that. They pop up a little bit more with Republicans than they do with Democrats, but still, regardless of how you register, racist language is the most offensive topic here. I've shown you this question before. What would you do if a podcast you regularly listen to featured an episode that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable? Not a massive difference here between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats are more likely to say that they would stop listening to that podcast, but 3/4 of both would continue listening to that podcast, right? So even though there's a bit of a gap here, certainly a tolerance gap, I would say, between Democrats and Republicans, over 3/4 of both say they would go back and continue to listen to that podcast, even if that episode offended them. Another question we asked, how would you feel about the brands that advertised on a podcast where the host or guest talked about something that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable? Again, there are some differences here between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans a little bit more tolerant, but both in terms of much lower opinion or somewhat lower opinion, they're about the same when you add those two together. So not necessarily huge differences there, although again, there are differences in what both parties find actually offensive. Have you ever boycotted a brand that supported a podcast that offended you or made you feel uncomfortable? Democrats a little bit more likely to do that, slightly more activist about that. And again, the podcast audience is a little bit more Democrat, as I've already shown you, although I think, again, that will continue to change with content. But here's what's really fascinating to me. How likely would you be to stop listening to a podcast if you heard a political ad from a candidate who shares your views, a candidate you agree with? Nearly 4 in 10 say they would be likely to stop listening to that podcast if they heard an ad from a candidate they agree with. That's kind of dangerous. And of course, the danger is even worse if you hear an ad from a candidate who does not share your views. In that case, well over half say they are likely to stop listening to that podcast. So I think political ads are potentially incredibly divisive on a general podcast, right? On a podcast that is not necessarily about polarized political content. Same question, Democrats and Republicans. Similar answers if you add the very likely and the somewhat likely together here. Again, most people are not at all likely to say they're going to stop listening to the podcast. But again, about 4 in 10, right? More than 2/3 of Republicans and more than that with Democrats say that they would at least be somewhat likely to stop listening to a podcast if they heard an ad from a candidate who shares their views. And again, that's worse if it's a candidate who does not share their views. So political advertising is potentially extremely divisive, I think, on a podcast. And again, people self-select to listen to podcasts because they want to hear that content. They agree with that content. They're not necessarily looking for things that they weren't looking for. And just to kind of wrap this up, we looked at 2 very political podcasts, the Ben Shapiro Show and the Rachel Maddow Show, which appeal to different aspects of the political spectrum. Do you find the Ben Shapiro Show very offensive? You're more likely to say you do if you've actually never listened to it, because again, you find the host offensive and not necessarily the episodic content. But if you do listen, you are much more likely to say, I'm favorable towards the brands that support Ben Shapiro. 31% say they're much more favorable toward the brand, and 4% of those who listen say they're much less favorable. So again, the opinions that people have about the show and about the brands, they're not about the content of the podcast. They are about how they feel about the host. And you do see that again with the Rachel Maddow Show, which the percentage that find Rachel Maddow Show offensive, it's about the same actually between those who perceive it and those who actually listen to it. But again, for those who listen to Rachel Maddow, they are much more favorable towards the brands that support her show and support her content because they have self-selected to listen to that show and listen to that content. So a couple of final thoughts here before we wrap up. And I'm so grateful for all of you that logged in and joined us for this. Thank you so much for the gift of your time and attention. Remember, podcasts are an opt-in medium. People listen to content because they choose to, and they generally avoid what's potentially offensive to them. And if they're listening to a show repeatedly that is generally offensive to some people, it's because they're seeking it out, right? The greatest risk here for brands that advertise in podcasts is association with a problematic host or with a show that is generally offensive, and not with advertising in an otherwise uncontroversial show that might include offensive content as an outlier. People don't punish the brand for that, right? People will punish a brand if they associate with a host or with a show that is generally offensive, but with a show that is generally not offensive, they don't. They will go back to the show. They will treat it as an outlier, right? And I point this out, and I remind you, at the beginning, I talked about SNL, and I talked about Kanye West and his last appearance on that show. You actually did not hear anything controversial from Kanye West's last appearance on SNL, because even with just a 5-minute delay, that is the length of the delay between the live performance and what gets aired on SNL. So I'm sorry to burst your bubble here if you thought it was completely live. There is a 5-second delay. After Kanye's first music performance on his last appearance, he went on a fairly controversial rant about media bias. He was very pro-Trump. You never saw it. It was never aired. Lorne Michaels cut it. He cut that, and he cut Kanye West's second performance, which is why there were not 2 performances by Kanye West in that show. And that is with only 5 minutes to spare. That is only with a 5-minute delay, right? And still, that in all of that controversy was able to be avoided with just 5 minutes. So Kanye West's rant did not affect Taltz. It didn't affect Trelegy or Ozempic or Myfembree or Ernesto or Breztri or Despondex or however you pronounce that or whatever that is. It didn't affect any of that, right? Because you never saw it. And that's with just 5 minutes of tolerance, which of course in podcasting, we have much more. All of that is to say, no medium can protect itself from the off-camera or off-mic actions of its talent. But we have tools. We have brand safety and suitability tools, and we have the advantage of not being live, all of that working in our favor. So there's no reason why we can't actually be leaders in brand safety and suitability, because we have abilities, we have tools, we have the advantage of a medium that things like radio and television and live television don't necessarily have, right? So all of that is to say that, yes, brands and potentially controversial content, I think, actually sit well together because people self-select to listen to that content. And so they're not necessarily going to be offended by something that they generally listen to. But we can actually be leaders in brand safety, leaders in brand suitability, because we have the technology and we have the tools to mitigate all of that, right? So again, I want to thank SXM Media. I want to thank Veritone One, Mopod, BetterHelp, AudioHook, Wondery, Barometer, and NPR for showing leadership, helping to support all of this content. And on behalf of Brian and I, thanks for being here. Really appreciate your attendance. And I now turn you back to the rest of your day. This research will be available on the Sounds Profitable website very shortly, I think by the end of the day. And again, thanks so much for being here. And if I don't talk to you before the holiday season, happy holidays.